Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and today I'll be painting up the American Armoured Officer for Konflikt47. In my series, I've wanted to get all 5 released model sets painted up, and I'm well on the way to doing this. But this time I have some extras, because not only do I have the officer set, I have a half squad of the Heavy Infantry as well. These came with the USA Konflikt47 starter set I got years ago, just to get the Tesla Sherman for my Brits. The infantry and the 2 assistants to the officer are very similar indeed, and seemingly the biggest difference is that the assistants have goggles on their helmets, possibly night vis. The officer himself has a radio telephone in hand and is armed with a slung Thompson instead of the kind of mini Browning machine gun looking thing. The models are all well moulded and are obviously digitally sculpted, and so are very consistent. Almost too consistent. One thing I need to do before I paint is to get the models based, which I got stuck on for a little while because my Americans are on a rolled milliput texture. And how do I achieve that with these big pudding bases on the metal models? I really hate the idea of removing the entire pudding base and then gluing the model to the top of the milliput, because that's just really not very strong. But what I can do is carve down the pudding base around each foot to be 2 little puddings, and I can just about make those look like single large cobblestones, and we'll just ignore how every model just happens to be standing on the conveniently larger cobblestones on the road. My carving could have been a lot better here, but hopefully this is good enough to not be too noticeable. With that done, I can add the milliput to the bases, but to make sure that the models were securely glued, I want to leave gaps in the milliput to glue the model directly to the plastic. Now, I tried a few different techniques, and I've got 8 models to try on here, and I can tell you that every way I tried was fiddly and annoying. I smoothed the top surface of the milliput with water, which also stops it sticking to the roller, and I rolled out the cobblestone texture. I had to recut the edges on all of the milliput holes to make sure that the foot metal cobblestone piece would sit directly on the plastic, but they all went down well eventually. Assembling the rest of the models was pretty simple. I always wash metal models before gluing to help with that. The shoulders are ball joints to give a little bit of variety in the pose, and the heads glue into place directly. I particularly like that there are left-handed options for the arms, especially as America was not accepting of the left-handed in the 1940s, or up until today for that matter. I also noticed that the officer's head, which was moulded as one piece to the body, sits at a different height to the others, which are all ball-jointed necks. And it's kind of strange once you notice that that is just that little bit different. Anyway, enough of that, let's paint. I started by priming and then base coating with a dark green and gave it a little zenithal of a light green. The idea is that using an airbrush makes things quicker, but universally that isn't the case, and I've come to the conclusion that I need to have terrain handy to test the airbrush between colours, and between cleaning and between clogs. Eventually I did manage to get that sorted, and I also got a bunch of other American models done at the same time, which eventually I'll paint, probably. As with the others in this series, my first step with a physical brush is to get some black panel lining done early. Usually panel lining is a technique done very carefully at the end of a paint job, but I've found that putting it on early makes it very easy to go quick and messy, but to ultimately end up with a very strong and good effect. I noticed while performing this step that I had missed a gigantic mould line along the officer's helmet and arm, and so I set about dealing with that. Scraped it down, brushed on some airbrush primer and painted it in the dark green of the base coat. And this might end up being noticeable in the end model as being different green because it doesn't have the zenithal, but by the time I've put all of the other effects on, it will just look like natural variation rather than a repaint. I wanted to get all of the details base coated, so I started with metals. Some obvious bolts in the armour, the weapons, the magazines, and finally some of the mechanics involved with the backpack. I've been painting the web gear of my US troops tan, which goes very nicely with the mixed green and brown of their uniforms. I decided to keep the consistent colour of the gear on the heavy infantry, even though they are a solid green with not a brown shirt in sight. I wasn't convinced what this wrap on the back was. I thought it might be a sleeping bag or a tool wrap for repairs, but I picked it out in a different brown to visually separate it, at least from the straps. And here's what those first few steps look like. The zenithal base coat, the panel lines, metallics, and the other minor base coats. It all builds slowly, but I don't feel like I've put much work in so far. It's all pretty simple stuff. I'm not sure if these step-by-step turntable shots are helpful, but I've started with them, and so for consistency's sake, I shall continue. I'm about to coat the entire lot in a black wash, but first I want to pick out the cobblestones to make sure they end up right in tone. I have been using a red cobblestone, but I don't think that looks good in the slightest, so I've switched now to a simple grey for my most recent Americans. And whilst that doesn't look any better, at least it's less worse. And now the all-over black wash. Base, armour, gear, even the skin, which will hamper my inability to paint skin even further later on. And this black wash over an airbrushed highlight is a very strong effect that I've really liked to use on vehicles particularly. And as these armoured suits are not quite but very nearly vehicles in their own right, I'm certainly painting them in the same way. Well, before I embarrass myself with painting the skin, I'll give myself the pleasure of my favourite part of painting this type of armour. After that airbrush highlight and dark wash, the best thing to bring back all of the silhouette and shape of each of the parts is a good old-fashioned edge highlight. This is using the same light green paint that I used in the zenithal earlier, so the consistency of pigment in the model should help mesh the painted areas and features. I found myself going very heavy on this edge highlight. I often try to refrain myself because I do like a quite heavy edge highlight, but I felt this time it was quite suitable. The Konflikt47 Armoured Officers are loosely based in reality. They are aesthetically 1940s tech, but are naturally unrealistic because they didn't have power armoured suits back then, or even now. The Konflikt47 Armoured Officers are... so having a slightly exaggerated cartoony style paint job suits this just nicely. After that I went ahead with doing a terrible job at painting the skin. I tried to show some varied skin tones, but I didn't even manage that. I also cleaned up the bases and some of the other parts of the models. And at some point I should probably paint up the Jackal like Walker. Sorry for the tangent here, but this model also came in the USA starter box with the Armoured Infantry, and I'll probably paint it in exactly the same way, although as it's bigger it got the modulation highlight rather than the zenithal. It's kinda odd, not my favourite, but it is growing on me, I think. And once it's painted in the same way as the infantry, I'll probably like it a lot more. But here they are, all finished up and matching my light Stuart tank quite nicely, as it's painted in very much the same steps. I've tried to keep my armoured suits painted in the same or similar style to my vehicles for each nation, just to give that sense of consistency, and that also naturally separates them from how my normal infantry look, and these ones show my older red cobblestone, which I just think looks rubbish. Speaking of cobblestones, those extra large ones from the shaved pudding bases don't look as bad as I had feared them, so that's nice. I also think it's accidentally convenient that I got the heavy infantry for the Americans specifically, as they have a rule that you can't take the armoured LT without taking 2 squads of armoured infantry first. Well, instead of buying more of these, I can run this as an 8 model heavy infantry squad instead, with the lieutenant demoted to sergeant. Well, if you have any comments on my quick little paint job here, post them below, but for now, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.